This is the first chapter called The Fall to Earth. It's book one of a series. This book is called The Stranger. The city never truly slept, but at 3:03 a.m., it came the closest to dreaming. Neon signs pulsed with the irregular heartbeat of late-night commerce, casting pools of amber and rose across empty sidewalks. Delivery trucks rumbled through intersections like mechanical whales navigating an urban ocean, their drivers half awake behind wheels that steered themselves. In 10,000 windows, blue light flickered faces illuminated by screens, each absorbed in their own private world, connected to everything and nothing at once. It was this liminal moment between the city's last exhale and its first yawn that something extraordinary occurred. Though extraordinary was perhaps the wrong word, since no single person witnessed it. No surveillance camera recorded it, and no algorithm would ever flag the anomaly in its data streams. A figure stepped from the shadows of the Meridian Alley. Not stepped from somewhere else, simply stepped from the shadows themselves, as if the darkness had gathered itself into a human form and decided to take an evening stroll. His appearance was unremarkable, medium height, weathered coat, the color of old coffee, boots that had seen more miles than most cars. Yet there was something about him that would have drawn the eye had there been eyes to see. A quality of presence, a complete inhabitation of each moment that made the flickering neon seem dim by comparison. He paused at the mouth of the alley, tilting his head as if listening to a frequency just beyond human hearing. The city's electrical hum surrounded him. Transformer boxes, street lamps, the distant whir of climate control systems. But beneath it all, he heard something else. A deeper rhythm, like a vast creature breathing in its sleep. The stranger, for that is what we must call him, reached into his coat and withdrew a small notebook bound in cracked leather. The cover bore no title, only worn impressions where symbols had once been embossed. He opened it with the care of someone handling sacred text, revealing pages that seemed to shimmer with their own faint luminescence. He wrote something on the first page with a pen that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, though perhaps that was merely a trick of the neon light. The words he wrote were in no earthly language, yet anyone reading them would have understood their meaning. They dream of being awake. A cat emerged from beneath a parked car, orange tabby with one torn ear and eyes like green coins. It approached the stranger without fear, pressing against his leg with a purr that seemed to harmonize with the city's electrical hum. He crouched, running his fingers through his matted fur, and the cat's purr deepened, taking on an almost musical quality. "Hello, old friend," he murmured in a voice that carried traces of many accents, as if he had learned to speak in a dozen different places. "Still keeping watch, I see." The cat fixed him with a stare of unmistakable intelligence, then padded away into the maze of alleys that formed the city's hidden circulatory system. As the cat disappeared into the shadows, the stranger could have sworn he heard it whisper something in return, though cats, of course, do not speak. Or do they? To those who remember how to listen. The stranger watched it go, then turned his attention to the broader canvas of urban life unfolding around him. Each storefront told a story, the 24-hour laundromat where a woman in her 70s folded clothes with mechanical precision, her movements hypnotic in their repetition. The pharmacy where a security guard dozed behind bulletproof glass, his dreams visible in the subtle movements of his eyes. The bus stop where someone had scratched "Remember" into the metal bench. The letters so worn they were barely legible. A homeless man shuffled past, pushing a shopping cart loaded with the archaeology of urban survival, plastic bags within plastic bags, a broken umbrella that might still provide shelter. Books with pages that had been read so many times the words seemed to float free from their bindings. He muttered an animated conversation with invisible companions, his voice a low counterpoint to the city's electronic symphony. The stranger listened carefully to his words, not the surface meaning, but the rhythm and the melody beneath. In that rambling monologue, he heard fragments of cosmic law, remembered truths filtering through a mind that had been labeled broken, but perhaps had simply broken free from the collective hypnosis that kept most people locked in place. 7 comes after 6, the man was saying, gesturing emphatically at the empty air. But 6 forgets that 7 was always there. Round and round, up and down, the wheel keeps turning, but nobody watches the center. They think the motion is the message, but the message is in the stillness. The stranger nodded approvingly and added another note to his book, this one in the symbols that seemed to move across the page like living creatures. The homeless man paused in his journey, suddenly aware of being observed. He turned and looked directly at the stranger, and for a moment his eyes cleared completely. The two men regarded each other across the empty street, one carrying everything he owned, the other carrying secrets that would reshape the worlds. "You're new here," the homeless man said, his voice suddenly coherent, stripped of its earlier rambling quality. "I am," the stranger replied. "Most people can't see me, not really. They look through me like I'm made of glass." "What do you think makes the difference?" The homeless man smiled, revealing teeth that had seen better decades, but eyes that sparkled with unexpected intelligence. Some folks are awake, some are asleep, and some are pretending to be asleep because being awake is too dangerous. You strike me as the dangerous kind. And you? "Oh, I'm past dangerous. I'm free," he laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Been carrying this cart around for 15 years, collecting things. Want to know what I've learned?" The stranger waited. "Everything important weighs nothing at all. Everything that weighs something isn't worth carrying." He gestured at his cart with mock gravity. "I'm a philosopher of the essential and a curator of the forgotten. Nice to meet someone else in the trade." With that, he resumed his journey, pushing his cart down the empty street while humming a tune that sounded both ancient and completely new. The stranger watched him disappear around the corner, then made another note. The broken ones often see the most clearly. Further down the street, a taxi pulled up to an all-night diner. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting moving shadows across the sidewalk like a silent film projection. A young woman in scrubs, a nurse ending her shift, perhaps climbed out, swayed slightly with exhaustion. She paid the driver through the window, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were afraid that if any sudden motion that might shatter the fragile bubble in her composure. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. The city's light pollution and reduced the stars to a handful of persistent points, but they were enough. Just for an instant, her face transformed. The weariness fell away, replaced by something like wonder at the handful of celestial fires that managed to shine through humanity's electrical storm. At that moment, the stranger saw her as she truly was, not just a tired healthcare worker, but at the end of a double shift, but a being infinitely complex and with possibility, carrying within herself the same cosmic fire that burned in those distant stars. She was someone's daughter, someone's hope, someone's reason for believing that the world would be better than it was. She was a healer, a witness to birth and death, a keeper of secrets that could break hearts or mend them. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and the spell was broken. Wonder became worry as she read her message and arrived. Probably another shift. She'd need to cover it, for another crisis demanded her attention. Another small erosion of the boundary between her work and her life. She hurried into the diner, shoulders hunched against the weight of the invisible burdens. The moment of starlight connection already fading like half-remembered dreams. The stranger made another note. They remember. They forget they remembered. Then he walked on, boots clinking softly against the pavement, still damp from an earlier rain. The sound echoed between the buildings, casting a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the city's deeper pulse. Each step was deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world to reach wherever he was going, or perhaps as if his destination was not a place, but a state of being that he carried with him. The city revealed itself to him in layers, the surface drama of commerce and ambition, the hidden networks of need and connection, and beneath it all, the vast sleep that had nearly everyone in its embrace. Not the sleep of the body, but the sleep of consciousness itself. The walking dream that people called life, where they moved through their days like actors who had forgotten they were performing in a play. He passed a convenience store where the clerk sat behind reinforced glass, reading a paperback novel by the harsh light of the fluorescent bulbs. The book was something about dragons and quests, about heroes who discovered they were destined for greatness. The irony was not lost on the stranger. Here was someone dreaming about awakening to his true nature while remaining completely asleep to the magic that surrounded him every moment. A delivery truck idled at the curb, its driver unloading boxes with practiced efficiency. The man worked with the fluid grace of someone who had performed these motions thousands of times, his body on autopilot, while his mind wandered elsewhere. The stranger could almost see the stream of thoughts flowing through the driver's consciousness. Bills to pay, children to pick up from school, a marriage that needed attention, dreams that had been deferred so long they were beginning to fossilize. Yet as the stranger watched, something shifted. Perhaps it was the quality of the attention being directed at him. Or perhaps it was simply time for a small miracle. The driver paused in his work, a box balanced in his arm, and looked around as if seeing the street for the first time. He noticed the way the rain had left the pavement gleaming like black glass. He noticed the play of shadows cast by the streetlights. He noticed for just a moment the extraordinary beauty hidden in the most ordinary corner of the world. He set down the box with unusual care and took a deep breath, as if tasting the night air for the first time. Then he smiled, not the polite, perfunctory smile of the customer service, but of a genuine expression of wonder at finding himself exactly where he was supposed to be there. The moment passed. The driver resumed his work. But something had changed. He moved with slightly more presence, slightly more awareness of the small choreography of loading and unloading, of participating in the vast dance of goods and services that kept the city fed and functioning. The stranger nodded approvingly and added another entry to his notebook. At the corner of Main and 3rd, he encountered something that made him pause. A street performer, or rather the remnants of one, a small circle of chalk where someone had set up hours earlier, a few scattered coins, and propped up against a lamppost, a cardboard sign that read, "Wake up, this is not a drill." The chalk circle was more elaborate than it had first appeared. Looking closer, the stranger could see that it was an actual mandala of sorts, with intricate geometric patterns radiating out from a central point. Someone had spent considerable amount of time and effort creating this temporary work of art, knowing it would be washed away by the next rain or swept up by the city maintenance crews. The performer was gone. The message lingered. The scattered coins, quarters, dimes, and a few currencies suggested that performance had been successful, at least in economic terms. But the real success lay in the message itself, in the willingness of someone to stand on a street corner and remind passing strangers of something they had forgotten but needed to remember. The stranger smiled, the first expression that had crossed his face since arriving, and reached into his coat. He withdrew a silver coin unlike any minted on earth. It bore no national symbols or presidential profiles, only a spiral that seemed to turn when looked at directly, drawing an eye inward toward some invisible center. He placed the coin on the chalk circle, and as it touched the ground, the geometric patterns seemed to respond, glowing faintly for just a moment before returning to their ordinary appearance. From his notebook, he tore out a small piece of paper and folded it with quick, practiced movements into an origami bird. His fingers moved with the precision of someone who had performed this action countless times, yet each fold carried the freshness of the first attempt. He placed the paper crane next to the coin, and for a moment the paper creature seemed to flutter its wings before settling into the stillness. A police officer emerged from the diner across the street, adjusting his utility belt, checking his radio with the methodical attention of someone whose life might depend on such details. He was young, perhaps new to the force, with the eagerness and alertness of someone still learning to read the city's moods and rhythms. He glanced at the stranger with the practiced eye of someone paid to notice anomalies, and their gazes met briefly across the empty street. In that moment of contact, the officer felt a strange sensation, as if someone had asked him a question he couldn't quite hear. or as if he suddenly remembered something important that he couldn't quite name. The feeling was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. It reminded him of being a child, waking from a dream that felt more real than waking life, carrying some essential truth that dissolved the moment he tried to articulate it. He shook his head, attributed to the sensation to too much coffee and too little sleep, and continued his patrol. But something had been planted. As he walked his beat, he found himself noticing things he usually overlooked. The way the streetlights created patterns of shadow and illumination, and the small dramas playing out in the lit windows. The fact that he was a conscious being walking through a world full of other conscious beings and carrying their own hopes and fears and secret stories. The stranger continued his own patrol of a different sort, moving through the city's arterial system like a gentle virus of awakening. He left no obvious trace of his passage, yet something changed in his wake. A subtle shift in the city's frequency, a barely perceptible quickening of something, some deeper pulse. He paused at a 24-hour coffee shop where a barista worked alone, crafting drinks for the handful of night shift workers and insomniacs who comprised her clientele. Through the window, the stranger watched her move through the familiar choreography of espresso and steamed milk. Her name tag read Sarah, and she worked with the focused attention of someone who took pride in her craft even at 3 a.m. A customer approached the counter, a man in a rumpled suit who looked like he'd been working all night. He ordered without looking up from his phone, his voice flat with exhaustion. Sarah began preparing his drink, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was the weight of the man's exhaustion, or perhaps it was simply the influence of the stranger's presence watching from the street. Instead of simply filling the order, she looked at the customer, really looked at him. She saw the stress lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried tension like a physical weight, the small tremor in his hands that spoke too much of the caffeine and too little rest. Long night, she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than perfunctory politeness. The man looked up from his phone, surprised to be seen as something more than a transaction. Yeah, he said, and something in his voice suggested that it had been a long year, not just a long night. This one's on the house, Sarah said, sliding the drink across the counter. Something we all need, someone to notice we're here. The man's eyes widened slightly as he started to protest, but Sarah waved him off as he walked away. The stranger saw him pause at the door, looking back at the coffee shop as if seeing something for the first time. Then he continued into the night, carrying with him the small reminder that kindness still existed in the world. Well, Sarah returned to her work, but there was something different in her movements now. A heightened awareness of her role, not just as a service provider, but as a keeper of small graces, a dispenser of warmth in more ways than one. The stranger made another note in his book, then continued his journey through the city's circulatory system. By the time he reached the riverfront, the eastern horizon was beginning to pale. The city's night shift was yielding to the day shift, the eternal changing of the guard that kept the urban organism functioning. He stood at the water's edge, watching the current carrying debris toward the sea, plastic bottles, fallen leaves, fragments of dreams that had been written on paper and thrown away. The river moved with ancient patience, indifferent to human schedules and concerns. It had been here before the city, and it would be here after the last building crumbled and the last light went out. Yet it was also intimately connected to the human story, carrying away their waste and their wishes, reflecting their lights and their sorrows. A jogger passed by, earbuds in place, breathing hard as she maintained her pace. Her form was efficient, economical, the product of years of training and discipline, but the stranger noticed something else. The way she seemed to be running away from something rather than towards something, using the rhythm of her feet and the burn in her lungs to silence some inner voice she didn't want to hear. As she passed, the stranger made a small gesture. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift in her posture that somehow conveyed blessing and encouragement. The jogger felt it as a momentary lightening of her burden, a sense that whatever she was running from might not be as insurmountable as she feared. In the distance, a church bell chimed 6 times, its bronze voice carrying across the water and the awakening streets. The stranger checked a pocket watch, and then that showed hours. Well, the stranger checked a pocket watch that showed not hours and minutes, but phases of some more fundamental cycle. The breathing of universes, the turning of wheels within wheels, the eternal dance of sleeping and waking that governed all existence. He nodded, satisfied with something that only he could measure. The first phase was complete. The seed had been planted, the invitation extended. Now began the more delicate work of cultivation and growth. From his coat, he withdrew a small stone, smooth, warm to the touch, marked with the same spiral symbol as the coin he had left in the street performer's circle. He held it up to catch the first ray of sunlight breaking over the city's skyline. For just a moment, the stone blazed with inner fire, and anyone looking might have seen something impossible, a man holding a star. But no one was looking. The joggers were focused on their morning miles, the dog walkers on their charges, the early commuters on their phones. The extraordinary happened in plain sight, as it always did, invisible to the eyes that had learned to see only the familiar. Yet the light from the stone, it spread outward anyway, a wave of possibility moving through the city's awakening consciousness. In apartments and offices and coffee shops and subway cars, people would wake that morning with an inexplicable sense of anticipation, a feeling that something important was about to happen. The stranger pocketed the stone and began walking back towards the city's center. He had work to do, connections to make, seeds to plant. The Great Awakening would not announce itself with fanfare. It would begin as all real change begins quietly in the space between one breath and the next. He passed a newsstand where the morning papers were being delivered, the headlines full of the usual litany of crisis and conflict, but tucked between the daily dramas, he noticed smaller stories, a community garden that was transforming a neighborhood, a teacher who was revolutionizing education one student at a time, a group of artists who were using their work to bridge cultural divides. These were the real headlines, the stranger reflected, not the character failures of systems and leaders, but the quiet successes of individuals who had remembered their capacity to create rather than merely consume, to connect rather than merely compete. Behind him, the river flowed on, carrying the burden of dreams toward the infinite sea. Ahead, the city stirred to wakefulness, or what it mistook for wakefulness. And somewhere in that vast urban organism, a few individuals were about to discover their ordinary lives were about to become extraordinary. The stranger smiled again, consulting his notebook one more time. On the page below his earlier observations, he added a single line. The invitation has been extended. Now We wait to see who accepts. A delivery truck rumbled past, its driver humming softly to himself, the same driver the stranger had observed earlier, still carrying within himself the echo of that moment of unexpected wonder. The coffee shop. In the coffee shop, Sarah was preparing for the morning rush, but she moved with a new awareness of her role as a healer of small wounds and a keeper of grace. The homeless philosopher had found a warm grate where he could rest for a few hours, his shopping cart positioned as a barrier between himself and the world. Even in sleep, he smiled, as if his dreams were particularly entertaining. The police officer was filing his report for the night, but he found himself writing with unusual care as if the words mattered more than usual. And in a dozen other locations throughout the city, people were waking from sleep or arriving at work or simply going about their daily routines, but carrying within themselves a new sense of possibility, a feeling that the day might just hold surprises, that their lives might be more significant than they had dared imagine. A new day was beginning, and with it possibilities that most would never imagine, but some would sense them, a tickle at the edge of awareness, a feeling that something important was about to happen, that would awake, that they would wake that morning with an inexplicable sense of anticipation, not knowing that their awakening had already begun. In coffee shops and subway cars and buildings and artist lofts, the first ripples of change were beginning to spread. The stranger had arrived, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Though, of course, most people wouldn't notice that either, not at first. Some would, and that would be enough. The stranger reached into his coat one final time, withdrew a small card, no larger than a business card, made of paper that seemed to shimmer with its own light. On it was printed a simple message: "You are invited to remember who you are." He placed the card on a park bench where someone would find it later, someone who was ready to begin their own journey of awakening. Then he walked on, disappearing into the growing bustle of the morning rush, invisible once again to eyes that saw only the surface of things. But his work was just beginning. In the days to come, he would make contact with those who had felt the first stirrings of remembrance. He would gather them together to teach them what they needed to know, guide them through the challenges that lay ahead. The great work of awakening had begun, quietly and without fanfare, in the heart of a sleeping city. And though most would never know it, the world had just taken its first step toward a transformation that would echo through the ages. The invitation had been extended. Now the real adventure could begin.